I knew something was wrong when the radio called my name from a trail that had been closed for 11 years. It was 2:17 in the morning, and I was sitting alone inside the ranger station, listening to rain hammer against the windows, when the old handheld radio on my desk suddenly crackled to life. At first there was nothing but static. Then I heard 3 words through the interference. "Ranger Cole, come back." I froze because the voice sounded exactly like mine. Not similar, not close. Mine. I reached for the radio and asked who was transmitting, but there was no answer. Then it crackled again. "Ranger Cole, you left us." I looked at the trail map hanging above my desk and immediately noticed the red marker beside Trail 9, an abandoned mountain route that had been permanently closed after a series of disappearances more than a decade earlier. The trail hadn't appeared on my assigned patrol list in years. Nobody was supposed to be there. I tried convincing myself it was some prank, maybe another ranger with an old recording, but then the radio gave me coordinates. I wrote them down and felt the blood leave my face because they pointed directly to the old trailhead. 10 minutes later, against every instinct I had, I drove into the mountains. The rain had become heavier, turning the dirt road into mud, and by the time I reached the trailhead, the forest was almost completely black. The wooden closure gate was still there, half rotten and covered with moss. The warning sign said, "Access prohibited." I stood beside it for nearly a minute, listening. Then I heard something from inside the trees. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks again. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a rock. I called out, "Park ranger! If someone is injured, answer me." Nothing. Then the radio, clipped to my vest, whispered, "You shouldn't have come alone." I spun around so quickly, my flashlight nearly fell from my hand. There was nobody behind me. I checked the radio. The transmission light wasn't even on. I stepped over the gate. The trail immediately swallowed me. Trees crowded both sides, their branches twisting together overhead, and the rain muffled everything except my footsteps. About 20 minutes in, I found the first strange thing. A child's red raincoat hanging from a tree branch. It was soaked, muddy, and extremely old, but the inside was warm when I touched it. I pulled my hand away. I told myself it was impossible. Then I heard a little girl laughing somewhere deeper in the woods. I followed the sound for perhaps 50 yards before realizing something was wrong. The laughter wasn't moving away from me. It was coming from directly behind me. I turned. Nothing. My radio crackled. "Don't follow her," I whispered. "Who is this?" The answer came instantly. "You already know." Then the voice changed. It became the voice of an older ranger I had worked with years earlier, a man named Daniel Mercer who had disappeared during a winter patrol. His body had never been found. I heard his voice through the radio say, "Cole, turn around and go home." I actually started walking back. Then I saw the footprints. They were mine. They began where I was standing and continued deeper into the forest. But I hadn't walked there yet. Every footprint was perfectly shaped, pressed into the mud as if someone wearing my boots had passed through minutes earlier. I followed them despite myself. They led me downhill toward an area I had never seen on any official map. There, hidden beneath enormous rhododendron bushes, was an old ranger cabin. The windows were boarded up, the roof had partially collapsed, and a rusted metal number was still attached beside the door. 9. I knew that cabin shouldn't exist. Trail 9 had never had a cabin according to our current records. I pushed the door open. The smell inside was horrible. Wet wood, mold, and something metallic underneath it. My flashlight swept across the room and stopped on a desk. On that desk was an old ranger logbook. I opened it. The first pages were filled with patrol notes from decades ago. But near the end, the handwriting changed. The final entry was dated 11 years earlier, the exact week the trail was closed. It read, "We found the missing hikers beneath the eastern ridge. They were alive when we found them, but none of them would speak. They only kept pointing toward the trees. Tonight, they are gone again." The next page contained only one sentence. "Something in this forest is learning our voices." I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I turned slowly. Nothing. Then another creak. This time from the hallway. I raised my flashlight and saw a wet footprint appear on the wooden floor. Then another. Then another. They were coming toward me. I backed against the desk as the footprints continued appearing one by one, even though there was nobody making them. My radio whispered, "Don't look up." I looked up anyway. There was a person standing in the rafters. It was wearing an old ranger uniform. Its face was hidden in darkness, but I could see its boots dangling above me. The thing tilted its head. Then it spoke in my voice. "You left us." I ran. I don't remember getting through the doorway, but suddenly I was outside, sprinting down the trail in the rain. Behind me, something was running too. I could hear branches snapping and footsteps pounding through the mud. I shouted into my radio for backup, but instead of dispatch answering, I heard dozens of voices speaking at once. Some were men. Some were women. Some sounded like children. Every single one said my name. I kept running until I reached a clearing. My truck was supposed to be another mile away. But somehow it was sitting there in front of me with its headlights on. I rushed toward it, opened the door, and climbed inside. The engine was already running. I locked the doors and looked into the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in the back seat. I turned around. Nobody. When I looked back at the mirror, the seat was empty. Then the radio spoke. "Drive." I slammed my foot on the accelerator. I don't remember the road. I don't remember crossing the gate. I only remember reaching the station just before dawn. I ran inside and locked every door. My supervisor was there, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. He asked where I'd been. I told him about Trail 9. He went completely silent. Then he walked to the filing cabinet, pulled out an old folder, and placed it on the desk. Inside was a photograph from 11 years earlier. 6 rangers stood outside the closed Trail 9 entrance. I recognized 5 of them. The 6th was me. I stared at the photograph for almost a minute before asking him who the man beside me was. My supervisor looked confused. "That's Daniel Mercer," he said. "He disappeared 11 years ago." I shook my head. No, Daniel was never in that photograph. My supervisor turned the picture over. Written on the back were 7 names. 5 rangers, 1 missing hiker, and mine. But the date was 11 years earlier, before I had even become a ranger. I looked at my supervisor and felt something cold move through my stomach. Then the station radio crackled. A voice whispered from the speaker. "Ranger Cole, you forgot someone." My supervisor slowly turned toward the window. There, across the parking lot, stood 6 figures beneath the trees. They were completely motionless. One of them raised a hand and waved. Then every radio in the station switched on at once. And through all of them came my own voice, whispering the same sentence over and over. "Trail 9 is open again." I never went back into those mountains. But 3 weeks later, another ranger disappeared. His truck was found at the old Trail 9 gate. The driver's door was open. His flashlight was still running on the ground, and carved into the wooden closure sign, deep enough to split the wood, were 4 words. We are still waiting. Story 2. I was 3 miles into my night patrol when I realized the footsteps beside me were matching mine, not following me, not coming from behind me, beside me. Every time my left boot touched the wet leaves, another footstep landed somewhere in the darkness to my right, perfectly synchronized. I stopped, and the other footsteps stopped too. I raised my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only caught dripping branches and thick Appalachian fog. I waited, listening to the rain sliding from the leaves. Then I took 1 step forward. The second step came beside me. I took another. Again, the sound came from the darkness exactly beside my shoulder. I was working a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains that night, checking an old trail where hikers had complained about hearing someone walking alongside them after sunset. Normally, I would have dismissed it as an animal, but the previous ranger assigned to this section had written something strange in his final report. If you hear footsteps matching yours, do not acknowledge them. I had laughed when I first read it. I wasn't laughing now. I kept moving, trying not to look toward the sound until my radio suddenly crackled. Ranger Hale, return to the vehicle. I recognized dispatcher's voice, but something was wrong with it. The transmission sounded distant, almost underwater. I answered, "Copy." The radio responded immediately. "No, don't answer." I stopped again. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice whispered from the trees, "You answered." I felt every hair on my arms rise. I swung my flashlight toward the sound and saw a man standing between 2 trees about 30 yards away. He was wearing an old green ranger jacket, soaked completely through. His head was lowered. I called out, "Park Ranger, identify yourself." The man slowly lifted his head. His face was pale, almost grey, and his eyes were fixed directly on me. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand and pointed behind me. I turned around. Nothing. When I turned back, he was gone. I immediately started walking toward the trailhead. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were ahead of me. I could hear someone walking through the leaves in the direction I needed to go. I followed the sound for several minutes, until I saw a flashlight moving between the trees. I shouted, "Wait!" The flashlight stopped. I approached cautiously and found an old backpack lying in the middle of the trail. It looked like it had been sitting there for years. A faded ranger patch was sewn onto the front. Inside were several waterlogged papers, an emergency blanket, and a small cassette recorder. I didn't know why, but I pressed play. Static filled the air. Then a man's voice said, "If you're hearing this, you're probably following the footsteps." I froze. The voice continued, "They're not footsteps. They're an invitation." The recording became distorted. Then the ranger whispered, "Whatever you do, don't let it walk ahead of you." I stopped the recording. At that exact moment, I heard footsteps directly in front of me. One step, then another, then another. Something was walking toward me from the darkness. I raised my flashlight. Nothing. But the footsteps kept coming. They stopped less than 10 feet away. I could hear breathing. Slow, wet, human. Then a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have found the bag." I ran. I didn't care about protocol anymore. I sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at my uniform, slipping repeatedly in the mud. Behind me, the footsteps followed. Then they started running. I could hear something gaining on me. I reached a narrow bridge crossing a mountain creek and stopped because there was someone standing on the other side. It was the same ranger I had seen earlier. He was staring at me. I shouted, Who are you? He answered in a voice that sounded exactly like mine. I'm the one who came back. I stepped backward. The footsteps behind me stopped. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. When I looked forward again, the ranger was standing much closer. His face had changed. It looked like mine. Same eyes. Same nose. Same scar above my eyebrow. He smiled and said, "You don't remember leaving me here?" Then every light on my radio began flashing. Dispatch called my name repeatedly. I grabbed the radio and shouted for help. A woman's voice answered, "Ranger Hale, we have your location." I almost cried with relief. Then she said, "There are two of you." I looked down at the muddy ground. There were two sets of boot prints beside me. One belonged to me. The other was standing directly beside my footprints. I ran across the bridge. I didn't look back until I reached the trailhead. My truck was still there. I climbed inside and locked the doors. The moment I started the engine, my radio crackled one final time. "Ranger Hale, do not look in the passenger seat." I looked anyway. The old ranger jacket was lying there, soaked, covered in mud. And inside the pocket was my employee identification card. I grabbed it with shaking hands. The photograph on the card was mine, but underneath my name was a date I had never seen before. It was 11 years earlier. I drove straight back to headquarters. Nobody believed me until I showed them the card. My supervisor stared at it for several seconds before asking where I found it. I told him. He walked to a locked cabinet and pulled out an old missing person report. 11 years earlier, a ranger named Thomas Hale had disappeared on that exact trail. He had never been found. My supervisor looked at me and quietly said, "That's your father." I told him my father had died when I was a child. He shook his head. "We never found a body." I looked at the photograph attached to the report. It was the same face I had seen on the bridge, the same face I had seen in the darkness. Mine. That night, after everyone had gone home, I heard footsteps outside my office. One step, then another, then another. They stopped directly outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My radio crackled on the desk. My own voice whispered through the speaker, "You shouldn't have come back." Then something knocked 3 times. And from the other side of the door, a man whispered, "Son, open the door." Story 3. I had been a backcountry ranger in the Appalachian Mountains for almost 9 years. And in all that time I had learned one rule that mattered more than every other rule combined. When the forest suddenly becomes quiet, you leave. Animals make noise. Wind makes noise. Water makes noise. Insects make noise. But when all of it stops at once, something has changed. And whatever caused that change usually doesn't want you to know it's there. I learned that rule the night I found a shelter that didn't exist. It was late October, cold enough that the rain had begun turning into tiny pieces of ice, and I was patrolling an isolated section of trail far from the nearest campground when dispatch informed me that a hiker had activated an emergency beacon somewhere beyond an old ridge. The signal was weak and kept disappearing, but the coordinates were close enough for me to reach on foot. I grabbed my medical pack, flashlight, radio, and GPS unit and started up the trail. The farther I went, the darker the forest became. Clouds had swallowed the moon, and the trees were so thick that even my flashlight seemed useless beyond 20 feet. After nearly an hour, my GPS showed that I was only a few hundred yards from the beacon, but the trail ahead didn't look familiar. I had walked that section dozens of times. There should have been a sharp bend around a large rock formation, followed by a steep descent toward a creek. Instead, the trail continued straight into a wall of fog. I checked my GPS again. The coordinates were correct. Then I heard someone crying. It sounded like a woman somewhere ahead of me. I called out, "Ranger!" If you can hear me, answer. The crying stopped. A few seconds later, a woman's voice whispered, "Please." I'm cold. I followed it. Every instinct I had told me not to, but if someone was injured, leaving them wasn't an option. I pushed through the fog until I saw a dim orange light between the trees. At first, I thought it was a campfire. Then I realized it was a lantern hanging outside a small wooden shelter. I stopped immediately. I had never seen the building before. It looked old, much older than any shelter maintained by the park. The roof was covered with moss, the windows were dark, and beside the entrance was a wooden sign with one word carved into it. "Wait!" I called out. "Is anyone in sight?" A woman's voice answered, "Yes." I stepped closer. "Are you injured?" The answer came after several seconds. "Not anymore." Something about those words made my stomach tighten. I opened the door. Inside were 4 people sitting around a cold stone fireplace. An elderly man, a young woman, a teenage boy, and a little girl. All 4 were soaking wet. None of them looked at me. I asked how long they had been there. The old man slowly turned his head and said, "Long enough." I asked their names. He smiled faintly. "Names don't matter here." I looked at the young woman. She was staring at the floor. "Where did you come from?" I asked. She pointed toward the back wall. There was no door there, only a black wooden wall. "Through there." I thought she was confused. I checked the room carefully and noticed something strange. There were no backpacks, no food, no sleeping bags, no water bottles, nothing that 4 stranded hikers would normally have. I asked if anyone was injured. The teenage boy finally looked at me. His eyes were wide with terror. He whispered, "You need to leave before it comes back." I asked what he meant. The little girl answered instead, "It doesn't like strangers." I felt a cold draft pass through the shelter. The lantern flickered. Then I heard footsteps outside, slow footsteps circling the building. I immediately reached for my radio. "Dispatch. This is Ranger Hale. I have 4 hikers at an unidentified shelter, requesting emergency assistance." Static. I tried again. Nothing. The old man suddenly stood up. "Turn that off." I asked why. He pointed at the radio. "It can hear you through that." I laughed nervously. "What can?" Nobody answered. The footsteps outside stopped. Then there was a knock on the door. 3 slow knocks. The little girl began crying. The old man whispered, "Don't open it." Another 3 knocks. Then a man's voice came from outside. "Ranger, open the door. It's getting cold." I recognized the voice immediately. It was my supervisor. I moved toward the door. The old man grabbed my arm. "That's not him." I looked through the small window beside the door. My supervisor was standing outside. He was wearing the exact jacket he had been wearing when I left headquarters. His face looked normal. He raised his hand and waved. "Hale, open the door." I reached for the latch. The teenage boy shouted, "No!" The moment his voice echoed through the room, the thing outside slammed both hands against the door. The entire shelter shook. Then it started screaming. Not one voice. Dozens of voices. Men, women, children, all screaming my name simultaneously. I stepped away from the door. The old man whispered, "It knows you now." The lantern suddenly went out. Complete darkness swallowed the shelter. I heard the young woman whispering, "Don't look at the windows." Naturally, I looked. Something was standing outside. Tall. Far too tall. Its head was nearly level with the roof. I couldn't see its face, only 2 pale shapes where its eyes should have been. It moved around the shelter slowly, stopping at each window. When it reached the window beside me, I saw its face. It looked exactly like me. Same beard, same scar, same uniform. But its mouth was stretched into an impossible smile. It whispered through the glass, "Let me in." I stepped backward and nearly fell over the fireplace. The 4 people were gone. The shelter was empty. I shouted their names, but there was no answer. Then I heard the little girl's voice behind me. "You shouldn't have looked." I turned. She was standing in the corner. Her face was covered in blood. "What happened to you?" I asked. She pointed toward the floor. "They came through there." I looked down. Beneath the old wooden floorboards, something was moving. The boards began lifting one by one. I backed toward the door, but the thing outside was still standing there. Then the floor cracked open. A hand emerged. Then another. Then a face. It was the old man. He pulled himself through the opening and looked at me with terrified eyes. "Run!" I kicked the door open and sprinted into the forest. Behind me, the shelter erupted with screaming. I didn't stop. I ran blindly through the fog until I reached the ridge. My GPS suddenly came back online. According to the device, I was nearly 3 miles away from where I thought I was. I turned around. The shelter was gone. There was nothing there except trees. I ran until dawn. When I finally reached the main trail, another ranger found me sitting beside the road, covered in mud and blood. I told him what happened. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked me to describe the shelter. I did. His expression changed. "That building hasn't existed since 1964. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He took me back to headquarters and showed me an old photograph from the park archives. It showed the same shelter, the same lantern, the same wooden sign. Standing outside it were 4 people: an elderly man, a young woman, a teenage boy, and a little girl. I recognized every one of them. They were the people I had met. The photograph was dated October 27th, 1964. The ranger beside me whispered, "They disappeared during a storm. Search teams looked for them for 3 weeks. I asked what happened afterward. He turned the photograph over. On the back, someone had written, "Found the shelter. No bodies. 4 sets of footprints leading inside. None leading out." I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, my radio turned on by itself at exactly 2:13 in the morning. Static filled my bedroom. Then the little girl's voice whispered, "Ranger Hale, we found another shelter." I sat frozen in bed. She continued, "This one has room for you." Then came 3 knocks from inside my bedroom closet. 3 slow knocks. I never opened that closet. The next morning, there were wet footprints across my bedroom floor. They started at the closet door and stopped beside my bed. And the last footprint was shaped exactly like the boot I was wearing. Story 4. I was halfway through my overnight patrol when I heard a woman screaming beneath the mountain. And the worst part was that I knew exactly where the sound was coming from because there was no cave beneath that section of trail. I had worked that stretch of Appalachian wilderness for 6 years, and I knew every creek crossing, every abandoned fire road, every dangerous cliff, and every hollow where hikers occasionally got themselves lost. So when the scream came from somewhere directly beneath my boots at 1:43 in the morning, my first thought was that somebody had fallen into an old mine shaft, but there were no mine shafts anywhere on the official maps. I stopped in the middle of the trail and listened. The forest was completely silent. No insects, no wind, no distant creek. Nothing. Then the woman screamed again. "Help me!" I immediately grabbed my radio and reported the possible emergency, but dispatch responded with something that made no sense. "Ranger Cole, There is nobody in that area. I told them I could hear someone screaming beneath the trail. There was a long pause before dispatch answered, "Do not investigate the sound." That was unusual enough to make me stop moving. Rangers aren't normally told not to investigate an emergency. I asked why, but dispatch only repeated the same sentence. "Return to your vehicle." I should have listened. Instead, I crouched down and placed my ear against the ground. At first, I heard nothing. Then came a faint tapping. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Then 3 more. It sounded like someone knocking from underneath the earth. I stood up and immediately noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a narrow crack running across the trail. It wasn't there when I came through earlier. I knelt beside it and shined my flashlight down. The crack was only a few inches wide, but the light seemed to disappear into an enormous darkness below. Then I heard a man's voice from inside. "Ranger, please." I asked who he was. The voice answered, "You already know." My stomach tightened. I recognized it. It belonged to a ranger named Michael Voss, who had disappeared on that same mountain 12 years earlier. His body had never been found. I stepped backward and called dispatch again. "I'm hearing Michael Voss." There was silence. Then dispatch said something very quietly. "Do not answer him." I didn't. For several minutes I stood there staring at the crack. Then something moved beneath it. A pale hand slowly appeared through the opening. I stumbled backward and drew my flashlight toward it. The fingers curled around the edge of the crack. Then another hand appeared. The person underneath began pulling himself upward. I could see a ranger uniform, soaked with mud. Then a face emerged. It was Michael Voss. He looked exactly like the photograph from his missing person file, except his skin was pale and his eyes were completely black. He smiled at me and whispered, "I finally found the way out." I ran. I didn't care about the patrol anymore. I sprinted downhill, slipping through mud and roots while something crashed through the forest behind me. It wasn't running like a human. It moved too quickly, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. Every few seconds I heard Michael's voice shouting my name. "Cole! Wait!" I didn't turn around. Then I heard my own voice behind me. "Cole! Wait!" I stopped for half a second. That was my voice. Exactly my voice. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. The forest was empty. I kept running until I reached an old maintenance road. My truck was parked another half-mile away. I pulled out my radio and called dispatch. "I'm leaving the area." No response. I tried again. Static. Then a woman's voice whispered, "Don't go to the truck." I froze. "Who is this?" The answer came immediately. "Me." I looked toward the road. My truck's headlights had switched on by themselves. The driver's door slowly opened. I could see someone sitting inside. A ranger. He was facing away from me. I shouted, "Michael!" The figure slowly turned its head. It was me. Not someone who looked like me. Me. Same uniform. Same face. Same bloodstain on my sleeve. The thing smiled and waved. My radio crackled. "Ranger Cole, get away from the vehicle." I backed into the trees. The figure inside my truck climbed out and began walking toward me. I ran again. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't let that thing catch me. Behind me, it started laughing. Then it stopped. I heard footsteps beside me. I turned my flashlight to the right and saw Michael Voss walking between the trees. He wasn't chasing me anymore. He was simply walking alongside me. He looked exhausted. His face was covered in dirt. "Don't run," he said. "It hears you when you run." I asked what he meant. He pointed toward the ground. "We're not above it." I looked down. The forest floor was moving. Not shaking. Moving. The leaves were slowly sliding toward one point beneath us, as if something enormous was breathing underneath the mountain. Michael whispered, "It has been under this trail longer than the park has existed." I asked him how he survived. He looked at me and said, "I didn't." Then he disappeared. I stood alone in the darkness, listening to the earth breathe. A low rumbling sound began beneath my feet. The crack in the trail was spreading. Trees started leaning toward the center of the mountain. Then every radio frequency suddenly came alive. Hundreds of voices began speaking simultaneously. Missing hikers, rangers, children, old men, women. People who had disappeared decades ago. They were all calling for help. Then one voice became clear. It was my mother's voice. She said my name. I hadn't heard her voice in years. I almost answered. Then I remembered Michael's warning. It hears you when you run. It also hears you when you answer. I closed my mouth and started walking backward. The voices followed me. "Cole, please, help us. We're cold. Don't leave us." I kept walking until sunrise. When I finally reached the main road, another ranger found me. I told him everything. He looked terrified when I mentioned Michael Voss. Then he asked me one question. "Did you hear the tapping?" I nodded. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. His face went pale. He told me the park had received reports of the same sound for decades, but every investigation ended the same way. Equipment disappeared, searchers became disoriented, and sometimes people never came back. He also told me something that had never been included in the public reports. Every person who disappeared had heard a voice they personally recognized before they vanished. That afternoon, I returned to headquarters and looked through Michael Voss's old personnel file. His final patrol report was only 3 sentences long. "There is something beneath the mountain. It knows our names. If you hear someone calling from underground, don't answer." The final line had been written in different handwriting. "It has learned mine." I thought about that sentence for years. Then, last winter, another ranger disappeared on the same trail. His radio was recovered 2 days later. There was only one recording on it. At first, it was static. Then came 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Then my own voice whispered through the recording. "Ranger Cole, I can hear you breathing." I hadn't been anywhere near that mountain when the recording was made. But the next morning, I found 3 small, muddy footprints outside my bedroom door. They were facing inward. And from somewhere beneath the floorboards came 3 slow knocks. Story 5. I was halfway through a routine night patrol on an isolated section of the Appalachian Trail when my radio received a distress call from a hiker who officially did not exist. And I remember thinking that there was something wrong with the transmission before I even heard the man's voice, because it was coming through on a frequency that our park radios hadn't used in more than 20 years. It was 12:36 a.m. The temperature was dropping quickly, and a thick Appalachian fog had settled between the trees, turning my flashlight beam into a narrow white tunnel. I was checking an old trail section after several reports of hikers hearing footsteps behind them when the radio suddenly crackled. "Please, Ranger, I need help." I stopped immediately. "This is Park Ranger Hale. State your location." Static answered me for several seconds. Then the man said, "I'm at the shelter." I asked which shelter. He whispered, "The one you're standing beside." I looked around. There was no shelter. I was standing beside an empty trail surrounded by trees. I checked my GPS. Nothing. I asked him to describe his surroundings. He said, "There's a fire outside. 3 people are sitting around it. They're all looking at you." I slowly turned my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Then the voice said, "Don't turn around again." My heart started pounding. I asked him who he was. He answered with a name that made me stop breathing. Evan Miller. Evan Miller was a hiker who had disappeared on that mountain 9 years earlier. I knew his name because I had personally read his missing person file during my first year as a ranger. His tent had been found beside the trail. His boots were inside it. His food was untouched. His body was never recovered. I whispered, "Evan, where are you?" The radio answered, "Behind you." I turned. There was a man standing 30 feet away. He was wearing an old hiking jacket, soaked completely through. His face was pale. His hair was covered in leaves, and his eyes were fixed on me. I called out his name. He smiled. "You finally heard me." I took one step backward. He took one step forward. I raised my flashlight and suddenly noticed something impossible. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was hovering just above the wet leaves. I reached for my radio, but before I could speak, Evan whispered, "Don't let them see you." I asked who they were. He pointed behind me. I turned slowly. There were 3 people standing between the trees. An old woman, a young man, and a little boy. All 3 were staring directly at me. Their faces were expressionless. The little boy raised his hand and waved. Then Evan grabbed my arm. His hand was freezing cold. "Run!" I didn't question him. We sprinted down the trail together. For several minutes, I heard nothing except my own breathing and the sound of branches snapping behind us. Then Evan suddenly stopped. I turned toward him. He was staring at the trees. "They're coming." I asked who they were. He said, "The people who don't know, they're dead." I thought he was insane until I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Slow, heavy, more than one person, then dozens. I pulled my flashlight toward the trail. Nothing was visible, but the footsteps kept coming. Evan whispered, "They follow anyone who hears the call." I asked him what call. He looked at my radio. "That one." The radio suddenly switched on. A woman's voice said, "Ranger Hale, please come back." Then a man's voice, "We're lost." Then a child, "We're cold." Then Evan's voice, "Don't listen." I switched the radio off. It turned itself back on. The voices became louder. I threw the radio onto the ground. The moment it hit the dirt, every voice stopped. The forest became completely silent. Evan looked at me and said, "Now, we have to get to the river." We moved quickly. After 10 minutes, we reached a steep slope leading toward a creek. Evan suddenly stopped again. "We're too late." I asked why. He pointed toward the opposite ridge. There were lights moving through the trees. Dozens of them. Flashlights, lanterns, headlamps. People were walking toward us. I could hear them whispering, "Hiker, Ranger, come with us." Evan grabbed my shoulder. "Whatever happens, don't answer them." We ran downhill. The creek was swollen from recent rain, but I crossed it anyway. Evan followed. Halfway across, I heard someone calling my name from the other side. It was my supervisor. "Hale, stop! Come back!" I almost turned. Then Evan shouted, "That's not him!" We reached the opposite bank. I looked back. Evan was standing in the middle of the creek. He wasn't moving. "Come on!" I shouted. He shook his head. "I can't cross." I asked why. He looked down at the water. They don't cross running water. Behind him, the lights were getting closer. Dozens of figures emerged from the trees. Evan looked at me one final time. "When you get back, don't tell them you saw me." Then the figures reached him. They surrounded him completely. I heard him scream once. Then the lights disappeared. I ran until sunrise. When I reached the ranger station, I was exhausted and covered in mud. My supervisor asked where I had been. I told him everything. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he asked, "What was the hiker's name?" I said, "Evan Miller." My supervisor looked at me strangely. "Hale, Evan Miller wasn't a hiker." I opened the missing person file. The photograph showed the same man I had seen. My supervisor continued, "Evan Miller was a park ranger." I felt sick. "No. He told me he was a hiker." My supervisor shook his head. "He disappeared 9 years ago while investigating missing hikers." I looked at the photograph again. Evan was wearing a ranger uniform. Not hiking clothes, not the jacket I had seen. A uniform. Then my supervisor opened another file. It contained the final recording from Evan's patrol radio. The recording began with static. Then Evan's voice said, "I've found the hikers." A woman's voice responded, "Bring them back." Evan whispered, "I can't." The woman asked why. Evan answered, "Because they aren't hikers anymore." Then there was a long silence. Finally, Evan said, "They're following me." The recording ended. I asked my supervisor what happened after that. He looked at me and said, "Every ranger assigned to that trail since then has reported hearing a distress call." I asked him what the call says. He didn't answer. He simply looked at my radio. It was sitting on the desk. I hadn't turned it on. Suddenly, it crackled. A man's voice came through. "Ranger Hale." I froze. It was Evan. "You shouldn't have brought them across the river." I looked at my supervisor. His face had gone completely white. Then something knocked on the station door 3 times. My supervisor whispered, "Don't answer." Another knock. Then a child's voice came through the door. "Ranger, we're cold." I looked toward the window. Outside, standing beneath the trees, was Evan Miller. Behind him were the 3 figures from the forest, and behind them were dozens more. All of them were staring directly at the station. Then Evan lifted one hand and pointed toward my radio. It crackled again. His voice whispered, "The river only keeps them out until someone invites them in." Story 6. I was assigned to an old fire tower deep in the Appalachian Mountains because the ranger who normally watched it had stopped answering his radio. And when I first heard that, I assumed he had simply fallen asleep. But my supervisor looked unusually serious when he handed me the keys and said, "Whatever you hear up there tonight, stay inside the tower after midnight." I asked him what that meant, and he only repeated himself. "Don't go outside after midnight." The tower sat on top of a mountain almost 4 miles from the nearest service road, surrounded by dense forest and steep cliffs. It hadn't been used regularly in years, but the park still maintained it during fire season. I reached the tower just before sunset. The previous ranger's truck was parked beneath it, unlocked, with the driver's door open. His radio was still inside. His lunch was sitting on the dashboard. There was no sign of a struggle. I climbed the metal stairs and entered the tiny observation cabin at the top. Everything looked normal except for one thing. Someone had written a message across the inside of the window with a finger through the dust. "Don't watch the tree line." I stared at it for several seconds before wiping it away. At 9 p.m., I contacted headquarters. Everything was quiet. At 10:30, I heard something moving in the forest below. I looked down and saw a flashlight traveling between the trees. It moved slowly toward the tower, stopped, then disappeared. I called out, "Park ranger!" No answer. At 11:15, the same flashlight appeared again, this time on the opposite side of the mountain. That should have been impossible because there was no trail connecting the 2 locations. I watched it for several minutes until it suddenly went out. Then my radio crackled. "Ranger Hale," I answered. Go ahead, a man's voice whispered. Don't look down. I immediately recognized the voice. It belonged to the missing ranger. Where are you? I asked. The answer came after several seconds. I'm underneath you. I looked at the floor. Nothing. What happened? I asked. The radio hissed. I made the mistake of watching the tree line. Then the transmission ended. At exactly midnight, the forest changed. Every insect stopped. The wind disappeared. Even the leaves stopped moving. I remembered my supervisor's warning. Stay inside. I locked the door. 5 minutes later, something walked around the tower. I could hear footsteps on the metal platform outside. Slow footsteps. One complete circle. Then another. Then another. I kept my eyes away from the windows. After the third circle, someone knocked on the cabin door. 3 times. I didn't move. A man's voice said, "Ranger Hale, open up!" It sounded like my supervisor. I didn't answer. The voice tried again. "It's me. Open the door." I stayed silent. Then the voice changed. It became my own. "Hale, you know I'm outside." I felt my stomach drop. The footsteps moved away from the door and towards the window. I stared at the floor. A shadow passed across it. Something was standing directly outside the glass. Then I heard breathing. Heavy breathing. Right against the window. I wanted to look. Every instinct told me to look. But I remembered the message. Don't watch the tree line. I kept my eyes down. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then I heard hundreds of footsteps in the forest. I couldn't help myself. I looked down. The entire mountain was filled with people. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. They stood between the trees, completely motionless, staring up at the tower. Some were wearing hiking clothes. Some wore old ranger uniforms. Some looked like they had been dead for decades. None of them moved. Then every person in the forest raised their head at exactly the same time. I backed away from the window. The radio came alive. "You looked," I whispered. "Who is this?" The missing ranger answered. "Now it knows you can see it." The lights below began moving. Every figure started walking toward the tower. I watched in horror as they climbed the mountain. They weren't walking normally. Their arms hung straight at their sides, their heads tilted upward, and they never looked away from the tower. I locked the door again, even though it was already locked. Then I heard footsteps climbing the stairs. One set, then another, then dozens. The metal staircase began shaking. Someone reached the top platform. A hand touched the cabin door, then another hand, then another. Fingers appeared beneath the door. Human fingers. Too many of them. I backed into the corner. The radio whispered, "Turn off the light." I immediately switched off the cabin lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. Outside, the figures became completely silent. Then I heard one voice. A little girl. "Ranger, can we come inside?" I didn't answer. She started crying. "Please." Then another voice joined her. Then another. Soon, hundreds of voices were begging me to open the door. Some sounded frightened. Some sounded angry. Some sounded like people I knew. Then my mother called my name. I almost opened the door. I hadn't heard her voice in years, but I knew she was hundreds of miles away. The voices continued for almost 20 minutes. Then suddenly everything stopped. I waited. Nothing. I slowly approached the window. Dawn was beginning to brighten the horizon. I looked down. The mountain was empty. No people. No footprints. Nothing. I opened the door after sunrise. The metal platform was covered in muddy handprints. Hundreds of them. They covered the railing, the stairs, the walls. But there was one handprint on the inside of the cabin door. It was mine. I returned to headquarters that morning and told my supervisor everything. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he opened an old folder and showed me photographs from previous fire tower incidents. Every photograph showed the same thing: muddy handprints covering the tower after midnight. I asked him what happened to the previous ranger. He pointed to the final photograph. It showed the tower from the forest below. At the top window stood a man. I recognized him immediately. It was the missing ranger. But there was something wrong. The photograph had been taken 2 days after he disappeared. I asked who took the picture. My supervisor said nobody knew. The photographer had vanished before he could explain. Then he showed me one final document, a maintenance report dated 27 years earlier. The final sentence read, "The tower is not abandoned. Someone is still watching from above." I asked him what that meant. He looked at me and said, "We stopped sending people there because the tower isn't the dangerous part." I asked what was. He pointed toward the mountain on the map. The thing watching from the tower. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3:11 a.m., my phone received a photograph from an unknown number. It showed the fire tower. The picture had clearly been taken from inside the cabin. In the reflection of the window stood a man wearing a ranger uniform. It was me. I was standing behind the person holding the camera. Then another message appeared. "You forgot to look at the tree line." I zoomed in on the photograph. Hundreds of figures were standing among the trees. But one figure was different. It was standing directly beneath the tower, looking upward. I recognized the face. It was the missing ranger. And beside him stood another version of me. Then my phone screen went black. From somewhere outside my bedroom window came 3 slow knocks. I didn't look. I already knew what was waiting there. Story 7. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the trail marker pointing in the opposite direction, because I had personally nailed that marker into the tree 3 days earlier, and it had been facing north when I left. But now it was facing south, as if someone had turned the entire tree around during the night. I was working a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, where the trail passed through dense forest, steep ravines, and old-growth trees so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. And my assignment that night was simple: check a series of abandoned campsites after several hikers reported hearing someone walking around their tents after midnight. I started the patrol shortly after sunset, carrying my radio, GPS, flashlight, medical kit, and an old paper map, because the GPS signal in that region was unreliable. For the first hour, everything was normal. Then I noticed the trail marker. I stopped, compared it with my map, and realized the trail ahead wasn't supposed to exist. According to the map, the path should have curved east toward a creek, but instead it continued straight uphill. I assumed I had taken the wrong turn, so I checked my GPS. It showed me standing on the correct trail. I continued. 10 minutes later, I found another marker. This one had been painted with a number I had never seen before: 47. I radioed headquarters and asked whether there was a trail 47 in that section. Dispatch answered immediately. No. I told them I was looking at a marker. Silence. Then dispatch said, "Leave the area." I asked why. They replied, "Because there has never been a trail 47. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone. There were trees where the path had been. I stood completely still, trying to understand what I was seeing. I checked my map again. The paper showed the trail behind me. But when I looked up, there was only dense forest. I walked forward. hoping the trail would reconnect somewhere ahead. After another 20 minutes, I found an abandoned backpack lying beside a tree. Inside was a water bottle, a flashlight, a folded map, and a park brochure dated 19 years earlier. The backpack belonged to a missing hiker named Daniel Price. I recognized the name because his disappearance had been one of the oldest unsolved cases in the district. He had vanished while hiking alone. Search teams had found his campsite, but never located him. I opened the folded map. It was covered with handwritten notes. One sentence had been written repeatedly across the margins. "The trail moves when you look away." I laughed nervously because I thought someone had planted it there as a joke. Then I looked behind me. The trail had moved again. The path was now running downhill instead of uphill. I radioed headquarters. I found Daniel Price's backpack. No answer. I tried again. Static. Then a voice whispered through the radio, "Don't say his name." I froze. The voice was not dispatch. It sounded like an old man. I asked who was speaking. He answered, "Someone who said it too many times." Then the transmission ended. I decided to follow the trail downhill because it was the only route available. After several minutes, I reached a clearing I had never seen before. In the center stood a wooden sign. It read, "Welcome back." Beneath it were dozens of names carved into the wood. Some were hikers. Some were rangers. Many had dates beside them. The newest name was mine. My name had been carved into the sign years before I became a ranger. I stepped backward. Something moved in the trees. I raised my flashlight. A man was standing there. He looked like Daniel Price. His clothes were old, dirty, and covered in leaves. I called out, "Daniel?" He raised one finger to his lips. "Don't speak." I asked how long he had been there. He whispered, 3 days. I looked at the date on his missing person report in my memory. He had disappeared 19 years ago. I told him that. His expression changed. "No," he whispered. "I've only been here 3 days." Then he looked behind me. "You need to go before the trail changes again." I asked how to leave. He pointed toward the trees. "Follow the markers with no numbers." I turned to look. There were 3 trail markers ahead. One had number 47. One had number 12. The third had nothing on it. I started toward the blank marker. Daniel grabbed my arm. "Whatever you do, don't look back." I promised I wouldn't. I walked. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow footsteps. Daniel shouted, "Keep walking!" The footsteps became faster. I heard branches snapping. Something was following me. Then I heard Daniel scream. I almost turned around. His voice cried, "It's got me!" I kept walking. Then I heard my own voice behind me. "Please help me." I stopped. My own voice said, "It's me." I knew it was a trick, but then it began crying exactly the way I cried when I was a child. I kept walking. The blank marker was getting closer. The footsteps behind me stopped. Silence. I reached the marker and touched it. The moment my hand made contact, the forest changed. The temperature dropped. The trees seemed taller. The trail beneath my feet disappeared. I was standing in a completely different place. There was a campsite ahead. A tent. A small fire. And a man sitting beside it. He looked up. It was me. Not a reflection. Another me. He stood and said, "You're late." I stepped backward. He smiled. "I'd been waiting 19 years. I asked who he was. He answered, "The version that stayed." Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, despite every warning. Daniel Price was standing there. His face was terrified. He pointed toward the other version of me. "That's not you." The other me smiled. "He's right. Then the trees behind Daniel began moving, not swaying, moving closer. The forest itself seemed to be folding inward. Daniel shouted, "Run!" We ran together. The trail twisted around us, appearing and disappearing every few seconds. We passed the same tree 3 times. We passed the same rock 4 times. Then I saw something that made me stop. There were dozens of backpacks hanging from the trees. Every one belonged to a missing hiker. Some were decades old. Some looked brand new. One belonged to a ranger who had disappeared only 2 months earlier. I reached for it. Daniel grabbed my wrist. "Don't touch anything that belongs to the missing." We kept running until we reached a narrow stream. Daniel stopped. "This is the boundary." I asked what boundary. He said, "The trail can't move across running water." We crossed. The moment my boots touched the opposite bank, the forest behind us became completely still. Daniel didn't cross. He stood on the other side. I asked him to come with me. He shook his head. I tried once. I asked what happened. He looked down at his hands. He gave me back. Then he smiled sadly. "Tell them I'm still alive." I stepped forward. "Daniel." He raised his hand. "Don't say my name." Then the fog swallowed him. I made it back to the main trail just before sunrise. A search team found me several hours later. I had been missing for almost 36 hours. According to my watch, I had been inside the forest for less than 6 hours. They asked where I had been. I told them everything. They searched the area but found no evidence of Trail 47, no clearing, no shelter, and no Daniel Price. They did find one thing: the old backpack. The same backpack I had found in the forest. Inside was the folded map. When investigators opened it, they discovered something none of us could explain. The map showed the official trail system exactly as it should be, except for one new trail drawn in black ink. It began at the location where I had disappeared and continued deep into the mountains. At the end of the line was a single sentence: "Ranger Hale returned." I quit night patrols after that. I thought the nightmare was over. Then, 6 months later, another ranger disappeared on the same mountain. His body camera was recovered from the trail. The final footage showed him walking alone through the forest. At 1:18 a.m., he stopped and looked at a tree. A trail marker was nailed to it. The number was 47. He turned around. The camera caught his face. He was staring directly at something behind him. Then he whispered, "Hale." The footage ended. The final frame showed the trail behind him changing direction, and standing between the trees was Daniel Price, smiling at the camera. He lifted one hand and pointed toward the trail. Then a second figure stepped beside him. It was me. Story 8. I was 3 hours into what should have been the easiest overnight patrol of my career when my radio suddenly transmitted a distress call from my own ranger station, and the first thing that made my blood run cold was the timestamp attached to the transmission, because it said the call had been sent 14 minutes into the future. I was alone on a remote Appalachian ridge, several miles from the nearest paved road, checking an abandoned section of trail after hikers reported seeing a light moving through the forest every night at exactly 2:40 a.m. The weather was terrible that evening. Heavy rain had turned the trail into mud. Fog was settling between the trees, and the wind kept pushing branches across the path. I had almost finished my patrol when my radio crackled. "Ranger Hale, respond." I recognized my supervisor's voice. I answered. "Go ahead." He sounded terrified. "Get off the trail immediately." I asked why. He said, "Because we're watching you." I stopped walking. "Who's watching me?" There was a long pause. Then he whispered, "We don't know." The transmission ended. I checked the radio display. The message had been logged at 2:26 a.m. My watch read 2:12. I stared at it for several seconds, wondering if the radio had malfunctioned. Then it transmitted again. "Hale, do not turn around." This time, the voice was mine. I slowly lowered my radio. I could hear something breathing behind me. I didn't turn around. I kept walking. The breathing followed. Every few seconds, I heard a wet step behind me. One step. Pause. Another step. I increased my pace. The footsteps matched me. I stopped. They stopped. I took one step. They took one step. Then I heard a whisper directly behind my ear. "You're almost there." I spun around. Nothing. Only trees and fog. I raised my flashlight toward the trail and saw a small wooden sign I had never seen before. It read, "Ranger Station, 0.4 miles. I knew there was no ranger station anywhere near that trail. The nearest one was more than 7 miles away. I followed the sign anyway, because my radio had gone completely dead. The trail became strangely straight. No bends. No elevation changes. Just a narrow path disappearing into the fog. After several minutes, I saw a building ahead. It looked exactly like my ranger station. Same wooden walls, same porch, same windows, same flag beside the entrance. But there was one problem. My actual ranger station was miles away. I approached the building slowly. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was identical to the station I knew. The same desk, same filing cabinets, same coffee mug, same emergency maps. Even the clock on the wall showed 2:26. I checked my watch. 2:19. 7 minutes had disappeared. I walked toward the radio desk. Another radio was sitting there. It switched on by itself. "Ranger Hale, do not enter the basement." I looked at the floor. I had never seen a basement in our real station. Then I heard footsteps below me. I stepped backward. The radio crackled. "Whatever happens, don't let it hear you." I whispered. "Hear me do what?" The radio answered, "Speak." I immediately covered my mouth. Something moved beneath the floor. Then came 3 knocks. 3 slow knocks. The basement door opened by itself. A cold wind came up the stairs. I backed away, but the radio suddenly played a recording. It was my own voice. "If you're hearing this, you've already entered." I stared at the radio. My voice continued. "The station isn't a station. It's a trap. It copies places where people feel safe." Then another voice interrupted. A woman's voice. "Hale." I knew that voice. It belonged to a ranger who had disappeared 8 years earlier. "Hale, please." The voice came from the basement. I didn't answer. "Please, help me." I still didn't answer. Then she whispered, "I'm not alone." I heard dozens of people breathing beneath the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the building behind me disappeared. There was no station, no porch, nothing, just forest. I looked at my watch. It was 2:26, exactly the time shown on the station clock. Then my real radio came alive. Dispatch said, "Hale, where are you?" I answered, "I'm near the ridge." My supervisor responded, "You've been missing for 27 minutes. I looked at my watch again. Only 7 minutes had passed for me. Then dispatch said something that made me stop breathing. "Hale, we're looking at your GPS location." I asked where it showed me. He said, "Inside the ranger station." I looked around. I was standing in the forest. He continued, "We're looking at you through the station's security camera." I asked how that was possible. He didn't answer. Then he said, "You're standing in the basement." I looked down. I was standing on dirt. But beneath my boots, I could suddenly hear a low mechanical hum. The ground felt hollow. I ran toward the nearest trail marker. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Every few minutes I saw the same tree, the same rock, the same broken branch. I was walking in circles. Then I heard someone crying ahead. It was a woman. "Ranger, please." I followed the sound until I found an old ranger sitting beneath a tree. His uniform was torn and soaked. I recognized him from an old missing person photograph. "Are you Sarah?" I asked. She looked up. "Don't say my name." I apologized. She whispered, "It knows names." I asked where the station was. She pointed toward the trees. "It's everywhere." Then she said something I'll never forget. "The station doesn't call you because it needs you. It calls you because it already has you." I asked what that meant. She looked behind me. "You're not the first version." I turned around. There was another ranger standing 30 feet away. He was wearing my uniform. He had my face. He was holding my radio. He raised it to his mouth and said, "Hail, return to the station." My radio immediately repeated his voice. "Hail, return to the station." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Run!" We sprinted through the forest. Behind us, the other me followed. Every time we looked back, he was closer. Then Sarah suddenly stopped. I grabbed her shoulder. "Keep moving." She shook her head. "I can't leave." I asked why. She pointed at the ground. Her boots were disappearing into the soil. She looked at me calmly and said, "I've been here for 8 years." Then she pushed me away. "Go." I ran alone. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw the real trailhead. My truck was there. My headlights were on. I jumped inside and locked the doors. The radio crackled. "Drive." I started the engine. Then I noticed something on the passenger seat. A folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a ranger incident report. My name was written at the top. The date was tomorrow. The report said, "Ranger Hale disappeared during overnight patrol. Search teams located his vehicle at 2:40 a.m. The vehicle was empty." I looked at the clock. 2:39. 1 minute later, every light in my truck turned off. The radio switched on. My own voice whispered, "You're almost there." I looked toward the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in the back seat. It was me. He smiled and whispered, "You have 1 minute." I slammed the truck into drive and accelerated down the mountain road. At exactly 2:40, my radio transmitted one final message. It came from my supervisor. "We found your truck," I shouted. "I'm driving it." He responded, "No, you're not." Then he sent me a photograph. It showed my truck sitting empty beside the trailhead. The driver's door was open. The headlights were on. And standing behind the truck was a man wearing my uniform. He was looking directly at the camera. I looked into my rearview mirror. The man sitting behind me was gone. I pulled over and turned around. My truck was still moving. I wasn't driving anymore. My hands were on the wheel. But they weren't mine. I heard my own voice from the radio say, "Welcome home, Ranger Hale." Then the forest outside the windows disappeared completely. When the other rangers found my truck the next morning, it was parked exactly where the photograph showed it. My radio was still inside. So was my flashlight. So was my jacket. The only thing missing was me. They searched for 3 days. They never found my body. But 14 days later, a new ranger reported hearing a distress call from the same mountain. The voice on the radio said, "Please help me." When dispatch asked who was transmitting, the voice answered with my name. Then it said, "I'm inside the station." The ranger looked toward the trees. A light appeared in the distance. It looked exactly like the windows of our ranger station glowing through the forest, and on the porch stood someone wearing my uniform, waiting for him to come home. Story 9. I was halfway through a freezing overnight patrol in the Appalachian backcountry when my radio received a distress call from a missing hiker who had officially been dead for 6 years. And what made it worse was that the call wasn't coming from somewhere in the mountains. It was coming from inside my own patrol vehicle. It was 1:18 a.m. The temperature was barely above freezing, and a heavy fog had settled over the trail so thick that my flashlight illuminated little more than floating droplets. I'd been assigned to check an isolated section after several hikers reported hearing someone shouting for help from a ravine that wasn't marked on any current map. I was alone because the location was considered low risk, and after 6 years working those mountains, I thought I had learned to recognize every sound the forest could make. I was wrong. I heard my radio crackle from inside the truck before I even reached the trail. "Please, somebody answer." I stopped beside the driver's door. The radio was switched off. I opened the door and looked inside. The radio screen was completely dark. Then it crackled again. "Ranger, I'm trapped." I reached inside and turned the radio on. "This is Ranger Hale. State your location." Static. Then a man's voice whispered, "I'm in your truck." I froze. I looked through the passenger window. The seat was empty. I checked the back seat. Nothing. The voice continued, "Please don't leave me." I asked who he was. He gave me a name I knew immediately. Nathan Reed. Nathan Reed had disappeared 6 years earlier while hiking alone in that same mountain range. Search teams had spent 12 days looking for him. They found his backpack near a cliff, but there was no body. His family had eventually held a memorial service without him. I asked the voice how he knew my name. He answered, "Because you were the one who found my boots." I remembered those boots. They had been lying beside a trail marker, completely clean despite days of rain. I had always thought that was strange. I asked Nathan where he was. He whispered, "Under the trail." Then the radio went silent. I looked toward the mountain. A faint beam of light was moving between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward it. The beam disappeared whenever I looked directly at it, then appeared again farther ahead. It seemed to be leading me somewhere. After 20 minutes, I reached a narrow ravine. There was no trail on my map, but fresh footprints led down into it. I followed them. At the bottom, I found an old emergency phone mounted to a wooden post. The phone looked like it belonged in a museum. There was no cable connected to it, yet it was ringing. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. A man's voice whispered, "Ranger Hale?" I said yes. He replied, "You shouldn't have answered." Then the phone went dead. Something moved behind me. I turned and saw a man standing among the trees. He was wearing hiking clothes from 6 years ago. His face was pale and swollen, and one side of his head was covered in dried mud. "Nathan," I whispered. He nodded. "You came?" I asked where he had been. He looked toward the ground. "Here." I asked him to explain. He shook his head. It doesn't like explanations. Then he pointed behind me. "It's awake." The ground beneath my boots trembled. A low sound traveled through the ravine. It sounded almost like breathing. Nathan grabbed my arm. "Don't let it hear you." We moved toward the opposite side of the ravine without speaking. Then I heard something climbing behind us. Not walking. Climbing. Fingers scraping against stone. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. A hand appeared over the edge of the ravine. Then another. Something pulled itself upward. I couldn't see its face. Nathan whispered, "Keep moving." We ran. We reached a narrow wooden bridge spanning the ravine. Nathan stopped before crossing. "I can't go over." I asked why. He pointed at the bridge. Carved into the wood were dozens of names. Some were old, some were fresh. At the bottom was my name. I stepped backward. Nathan whispered, "It knows who comes looking." Then something spoke from the darkness behind us. "Nathan." He froze. The voice sounded exactly like him. Another voice called his name. Then another. Soon, dozens of voices were whispering his name from the ravine. Nathan looked terrified. "Don't answer them." I grabbed his arm and pulled him onto the bridge. We crossed quickly. Halfway across, something grabbed Nathan's ankle. He screamed. I looked down and saw a pale hand wrapped around his boot. I grabbed him and pulled. The hand tightened. Another hand appeared. Then another. Nathan screamed, "Don't let me go!" I pulled harder. For 1 second I thought I had him. Then he looked directly into my eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." He released my hand himself. I watched him disappear beneath the bridge. I heard him hit the ground below. Then silence. I ran without looking back. I reached the trailhead just before sunrise and found my truck exactly where I'd left it. I climbed inside and started the engine. The radio turned on by itself. "Ranger Hale." It was Nathan. I grabbed the microphone. "Nathan, where are you?" Silence. Then he whispered, "Behind you." I looked into the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Then I noticed muddy footprints on the floor. They started at the rear door and ended directly behind the driver's seat. I got out of the truck and ran to the ranger station. When I told my supervisor what happened, he looked through the old missing person records. He found Nathan's file. Inside was a photograph of the area where he disappeared. I recognized the ravine immediately, but there was something in the photograph that wasn't there when I visited. Behind Nathan stood a tall, dark figure. My supervisor asked if I had seen it. I said no. He turned the photograph over. On the back was a handwritten note from the original search team. Subject was heard calling for help from beneath the ground 3 days after disappearance. I asked what that meant. My supervisor said the search team had heard Nathan's voice coming from inside the mountain. They dug for 2 days and found nothing. Then the calls stopped. I asked why the case wasn't reopened when I heard him. My supervisor stared at me. "Because you're not the first ranger to hear him." He opened another folder. There were 11 reports from different years. Every report described the same thing: a missing hiker calling from beneath the trail. Every ranger who investigated reported hearing the hiker's voice. 8 of them eventually quit. 3 disappeared. I asked what happened to the last ranger. My supervisor didn't answer. Instead, he handed me an old radio recording. I pressed play. Static filled the room. Then a man's voice said, "Please, somebody answer." It was Nathan. The recording continued. "I'm trapped." Then another voice came through. It was mine. I froze. My own voice said, "This is Ranger Hale. State your location." I looked at my supervisor. He whispered, "That recording was made 6 years ago." I listened again. Nathan answered, "I'm in your truck." Then my voice asked, "Who are you?" Nathan said, "Nathan Reed." The recording ended. I stared at the radio. My supervisor quietly said, "That's the first recording from the night Nathan disappeared." I told him that was impossible. I hadn't been there. I hadn't even been a ranger 6 years ago. He nodded. "Exactly." That was when my radio crackled. The same voice came through. "Nathan. Ranger Hale." I slowly lifted the radio. "Where are you?" I whispered. His answer was barely audible. "Not where you think." Then another voice came through behind him. It sounded like me. "Don't answer him." I dropped the radio. My supervisor stared at me. What did it say? Before I could respond, 3 knocks came from beneath the floor of the ranger station. Everyone froze. 3 more knocks. Then Nathan's voice whispered through the floorboards. "Ranger, I'm underneath you." We evacuated the station immediately. Search crews dug beneath the building the following morning. They found no tunnel, no body, and no explanation. But they did find something buried beneath the foundation. An old emergency phone. It had no cable, no battery, no connection to anything. Yet when the crew lifted it from the dirt, it started ringing. Nobody answered it. I wish I could say the story ended there. It didn't. 2 months later, I received an envelope at my home with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed me standing beside my patrol truck on the night I heard Nathan's call. I was facing the mountain. Someone had taken the photograph from behind me. I turned the picture over. Written on the back were 5 words. "You left him under there." That night, at exactly 1:18 a.m., my home phone rang. I don't have a landline. I stared at it until the ringing stopped. Then my cell phone received a voicemail from an unknown number. I played it. At first, there was only static. Then Nathan whispered, "Ranger Hale, please answer." Behind his voice, something else was breathing. Then I heard my own voice say, "He's not alone anymore." The voicemail ended, and from underneath my bedroom floor came 3 slow knocks. Story 10. I was told never to patrol Black Creek after dark, not because of bears, not because of flash floods, and not because of the steep cliffs surrounding it, but because 3 rangers had disappeared there over a period of 17 years, and every one of them had left behind the same final radio transmission. "There is someone walking in the creek." I thought the warning was an old ranger superstition until the night my supervisor called me at 11:40 p.m. and told me that a hiker had activated an emergency beacon somewhere along Black Creek. The weather was getting worse, the temperature was dropping, and the nearest search team was more than 2 hours away. So I volunteered to go. My supervisor hesitated before saying, "If you hear footsteps in the water, don't follow them." I asked him why. He said, "Because the last 3 people who did never came back." I reached the trailhead shortly after midnight. The rain had turned the ground into thick mud, and the creek was swollen enough to cover several stepping stones. I switched on my flashlight and started down the trail. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard a splash. I stopped. Another splash came from somewhere ahead. I aimed my flashlight toward the creek. Nothing. I continued walking. Another splash. This time it was closer. I checked my radio. No transmission. Then I heard footsteps in the water. Slow footsteps. Someone was walking directly through the creek beside me. I remembered my supervisor's warning and kept my eyes on the trail. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. They started when I started. After several minutes, a voice called from the darkness. "Ranger?" I didn't answer. The voice called again. "Please help me." I kept walking. Then the voice changed. It became my supervisor's voice. "Hale, stop." I stopped involuntarily. The footsteps in the creek stopped too. My radio crackled. My supervisor's real voice said, "Hale, whatever you're hearing, don't respond." I asked him if he was monitoring me. He said, "No, I'm at headquarters." Then the voice from the creek whispered, "He's lying." I turned my flashlight toward the water. A man was standing in the middle of the creek. He was wearing an old ranger uniform. His clothes were soaked, his face was pale, and his head was tilted downward. I called out, "Are you injured?" He slowly raised his face. I recognized him from an old photograph. Ranger Thomas Bell. He had disappeared 12 years earlier. He smiled. "You finally came." I backed away. "Thomas." He pointed downstream. "They're still looking for me." I asked who. He answered, "The people beneath the water." I looked at the creek. The water was dark and fast-moving. I saw nothing. Then several pale fingers appeared above the surface. I froze. More hands emerged. Dozens of them. They were reaching upward from beneath the water. Thomas whispered, "Don't let them touch you." I ran. I didn't look back. I could hear splashing behind me, then footsteps on the trail. Thomas was running after me. "Hale!" he shouted. "Wait!" I kept running. The trail narrowed as it followed the creek. Suddenly I reached a wooden bridge. The bridge was old, but it was the only way across. I stepped onto it. Halfway across, the footsteps behind me stopped. I looked back. Thomas was standing at the edge of the bridge. He wouldn't cross. I shouted, "Come on!" He shook his head. "It knows where I am." Then the creek below began making a strange sound. The water started flowing backward. It climbed over the banks without spilling. It moved uphill toward Thomas. He screamed and ran. Something beneath the water grabbed his legs. He disappeared instantly. I heard a voice beneath the bridge. "Don't leave me." I crossed as quickly as I could. On the opposite side, I found an abandoned ranger cabin. The door was open. Inside were 3 old uniforms hanging on hooks. One belonged to Thomas Bell. Another belonged to Ranger Michael Gray, who had disappeared 17 years earlier. The third belonged to Ranger David Cole, who had disappeared 3 years after him. I looked at the uniforms and realized all 3 were still wet. Water was dripping onto the floor. Then I noticed a 4th hook. Empty. A name had been carved into the wood beneath it. My name. I backed away. My radio crackled. "Hale!" It was Thomas. "Don't stay in the cabin." I ran outside. The rain had stopped. The forest was completely silent. I checked my watch. 2:31 a.m. I had been inside the cabin for less than 5 minutes. But the sky was beginning to brighten. Dawn should have been hours away. I looked toward the creek. The water had disappeared. The entire creek bed was dry. In the center of it stood dozens of people. They were wearing old clothes, hiking gear, ranger uniforms. Some looked injured. Some looked decades old. All of them were staring at me. One woman stepped forward. "We're lost." Another voice said, "Please take us home." Then a child whispered, "Ranger, we're cold." I backed away. The crowd began walking toward me. I raised my radio and called headquarters. "Emergency. I need extraction from Black Creek." My supervisor answered immediately. "Where are you?" I gave him my coordinates. Silence. Then he said, "Hale, those coordinates are impossible." I asked why. He said, "You're standing in the middle of Black Creek." I looked down. Water was suddenly flowing around my boots. I hadn't moved. The crowd was gone. I was standing in the middle of the creek. I tried to step forward. My boot wouldn't move. Something was holding it. I looked down. A pale hand was wrapped around my ankle beneath the water. I kicked free and stumbled onto the bank. I ran until I reached the trailhead. My truck was still there. I climbed inside and locked the doors. The radio came alive. "Ranger Hale." "Thomas." "You crossed the creek." I answered. "Yes." He whispered. "Then it's following you." I looked into the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Then I heard water dripping. Drop, drop, drop. I slowly looked down. Water was spreading across the floor behind me. My radio crackled again. "Don't look behind you!" I stared at the windshield. The water kept rising. Then someone whispered directly behind my head, "You shouldn't have crossed." I turned. There was nobody there. I slammed the truck into gear and drove. I didn't stop until I reached headquarters. My supervisor was waiting outside. When he saw me, his face changed. He asked, "Where's your jacket?" I looked down. I was still wearing it. He shook his head. "No, you're not." I looked down again. The jacket I was wearing wasn't mine. It belonged to Thomas Bell. His name was stitched above the pocket. I ripped it off and threw it onto the ground. Water poured from the sleeves. My supervisor backed away. Then the jacket moved. One sleeve lifted slowly. A hand emerged from inside it. We ran inside and locked the doors. Search teams returned to Black Creek the next morning. They found my original jacket hanging from a tree near the creek. They also found footprints leading into the water. My footprints. I had no memory of making them. 3 days later, they found the old cabin. Inside, the 3 ranger uniforms were gone. There were 4 empty hooks. The 4th one had my name carved beneath it. I quit the following week. I never returned to Black Creek. But every year, on the same date, I receive a radio transmission on my old Ranger frequency. It lasts exactly 12 seconds. The first 11 seconds are nothing but rushing water. Then, during the final second, a man's voice whispers my name. Last night, after 11 years of silence, it happened again. But this time, there were 2 voices. The first was Thomas Bell. The second was mine. Thomas whispered, "We're still in the creek." My voice answered, "And we're not alone." Then I heard something I had never heard before. Footsteps walking through water. They stopped outside my bedroom window. 3 slow knocks followed. And from the darkness outside came a whisper. "Ranger, your shift isn't over." Story 11. I found the first trail camera hanging from a tree that wasn't supposed to have one. And when I checked the footage that night, I saw myself walking through the forest 3 hours before I had actually arrived there. I was working a remote section of the Appalachian backcountry where hikers had reported strange lights moving between the trees after midnight, and my assignment was to inspect several old trail cameras that had been placed along the ridge years earlier. Most of them were dead, damaged, or missing. So when I found one still blinking beneath the branches, I assumed I had gotten lucky. I removed the memory card and continued my patrol. It wasn't until I returned to the ranger station that I opened the files. The first several recordings were ordinary: deer, foxes, hikers, rain, wind. Then I found a video recorded at 1:17 a.m. The timestamp was from that same night. I hadn't reached the camera until 4:20 a.m., yet the footage showed me standing directly in front of it. I was wearing the same uniform, same boots, same flashlight, same radio. I stared at the screen and watched myself look directly into the camera. Then the person in the footage smiled. I stopped the video. My supervisor asked what was wrong. I showed him. He went completely silent. "Where did you find this camera?" he asked. I told him. He immediately told me to lock the memory card in the evidence cabinet. Then he asked one question. "Did you hear anything while you were out there?" I said no. He looked relieved. "Good. Don't go back." I asked him why. He wouldn't answer. The next morning I found another video on the card. It showed the same forest from a different camera angle. This time I was walking toward the camera. But there was someone following me. A tall figure dressed in an old ranger uniform. I watched the footage frame by frame. Every time I stopped walking, the figure stopped. Every time I moved, it moved. Then I noticed something horrifying. The figure had no face. I called my supervisor. He told me to bring the card to him immediately. Before I could leave, the ranger station radio crackled. "Ranger Hale." I looked at my supervisor. He slowly reached for the radio. "Who is this?" he asked. The answer was my voice. "I'm still on the trail." My supervisor turned pale. "You're standing right here." The radio responded. "Not yet." Then it went silent. We checked the trail camera again. A new video had appeared. Timestamp, 9:43 a.m. It showed me leaving the ranger station, but I was still standing beside my supervisor. In the video, the other version of me walked toward the mountains. Then he turned toward the camera and mouthed 4 words. "Come find me." I refused to go. My supervisor ordered the entire area closed. Search teams removed every trail camera they could find. They discovered 12 cameras. 11 were empty. The 12th contained footage. Every video showed the same thing: a ranger walking through the forest. Sometimes it was me. Sometimes it was another ranger. Sometimes it was a missing hiker. But every person in the footage eventually walked toward the same location: a clearing deep inside the mountain. The coordinates appeared on every recording. My supervisor didn't want anyone going there, but 3 days later, a search team lost contact with one of its members. They found his radio beside the trail. His last transmission said, "I found the clearing." I volunteered to join the search. My supervisor refused. I went anyway. I followed the coordinates. The forest became unnaturally quiet as I approached. Then I found the clearing. There were trail cameras everywhere. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. They covered the trees. Some were new. Some were ancient. All of them were pointed toward the center. I stepped into the clearing. A camera clicked. Then another. Then another. Every camera began recording me. I heard a sound behind me. I turned. Nothing. Then a voice came through my radio. "Don't look at the cameras." I looked anyway. Every camera screen displayed the same image: me standing in the clearing. But each screen showed me from a different angle. Some showed me from behind. Some showed me from above. One showed me standing directly behind myself. I dropped the radio. A figure stepped from between the trees. It was wearing my uniform. It had my face, but its eyes were completely black. It smiled. "You found the footage?" I asked what it wanted. It pointed toward the cameras. "Someone has to watch." I backed away. "Watch what?" It pointed toward the forest. Hundreds of people were standing among the trees: missing hikers, rangers, children, old men, women, all staring toward the clearing. Then the figure said, "They're waiting for their turn." I ran. I don't remember leaving the clearing. I remember reaching the trailhead at sunrise. My supervisor was waiting beside my truck. He looked at me and said, "Where have you been?" I told him I had found the clearing. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he asked, "Who are you?" I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He raised his radio and called headquarters. "We have a ranger here claiming to be Hale." A voice answered immediately. "Hale is still in the station." I looked at my supervisor. "That's impossible." He pulled out his phone and showed me a live security feed from headquarters. There I was, sitting at my desk inside the station. I looked back at the video. The person sitting at the desk was me. Same uniform. Same face. Same everything. Then the person on the screen looked directly into the security camera. He smiled. My phone vibrated. A new video had appeared on the trail camera memory card. I pressed play. It showed me standing beside my supervisor at the trailhead. Then the camera angle changed. The figure behind me leaned toward the lens and whispered, "He's the copy." I dropped the phone. My supervisor looked terrified. "Hale, stay where you are." I asked what he meant. He said, "We need to figure out which one of you is real." Then the radio crackled. The voice from headquarters said, "Don't trust him." My supervisor grabbed his weapon. I raised my hands. Wait. The radio continued. "The one at the trailhead isn't Hale." My supervisor stepped backward. Then the version of me standing beside him on the security camera smiled again. "Neither is the one in the station." Suddenly, every trail camera in the clearing began transmitting simultaneously. The radio filled with hundreds of voices. Missing hikers, rangers, children, all saying the same sentence. "There's only one real one." Then my supervisor looked at me and whispered, "Which one?" I didn't know. I still don't. Because when I returned to headquarters that evening, everyone insisted I had never left. They showed me security footage of me sitting at my desk all day. They showed me radio logs proving I had been communicating with dispatch from the station. But I remember the mountain. I remember the clearing. I remember the thing wearing my face. And 3 nights later, another ranger found the original trail camera hanging from a tree near the station. The memory card contained one final video. It showed me sleeping in my bedroom. The camera was positioned outside my window. The timestamp was 2 days from now. I watched the footage until the final seconds. Then I saw something standing behind my bed. It leaned toward the sleeping version of me and whispered, "Tomorrow, he wakes up." The video ended. I haven't slept since, because every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., my bedroom window makes the sound of a camera shutter. Click. Pause. Click. And last night, when I finally looked toward the glass, I saw a tiny red recording light blinking from inside the forest. There was no camera there yesterday,